Hi everybody, I am back to Vancouver, snowy Vancouver, which was a bit of a surprise. This video is part of Unit 3, but before I start the video, I would like to talk a little bit about your reflective journals and what you should expect in terms of feedback. Some of you have been asking me about that. So in order to talk about that, we need to remember what a professional master's is about, and maybe in relation to a research master's. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. A professional master's is about engagement with the bigger picture of a context and the academic literature or the academic conversation that has been going on in that field of study. So what you're expected to do is to be able to acquire tools and new ideas in the process of engaging in these conversations, in the policy conversation, the practitioner, bigger picture conversation, and the academic conversation, in order to bring new tools and ideas to your own context, to your own practice, to your own professional communities. So different from a research master's, where you are embarking on an academic career where you are expected to produce articles that are going to be published and they're going to talk back to the authors of these texts. You are not expected to be addressing other academics. You're in this process. In a professional master's, you're expected to address your peers. So with that in mind, the exercises in the course, all the exercises, have been designed to help you engage with these bigger picture issues and the texts and draw your own conclusions. So when you're writing your reflective journals, there's a latitude of possibilities for what could be considered good answers or correct answers. I cannot comment on that because you're an expert in your context. You know what the challenges are, what the complexities are, and I really trust your independent thinking or the development of this independent thinking for you to achieve that level of relationship between what you're reading and what you're doing in your practice. So in the beginning of the course, I told you that I lovingly don't care what you think. I do care how you engage with things, how deep you can think, and the breadth of your thinking. And the exercises are pushing you to do that. And within that, there is a lot of flexibility in terms of where these things can go. So instead of an assessor of your reflective journals, I am much more of a witness of the process. And I do use what I learn in reading your journals in the input. So I prepare myself to address some of the questions or to dig a little bit deeper in that sense. But it's not for me to decide what your conclusions are going to be, and I'm fine with any conclusion. So if you want me to answer any specific questions, I will. But if you are not asking me any questions, and if I see that you are within this window of possibilities of responses, you're not going to hear from me. I'm just going to be reading it and enjoying the process with you and trusting your judgment, right? That you're taking it at your pace and where you want to take it. What was I going to say? Some of you have asked me to comment on whether or not you were following the guidelines, and I think there's some flexibility there as well. So unless what you're doing is completely out of what has been asked, or if it is going to have negative consequences for you, for example, because some of the exercises build your skills for the open book exam, for example. So if I see that you're doing something that is against your best interest, I'm going to tell you. And it's, again, up to you to decide to follow my advice or not. But otherwise, I'm happy to read what you write, even if you rebel a little bit against the guidelines. That's also fine. The exercise needs to work for you, not for me. However, there's an element in it where I need to push a little bit, and I'm trying to do that through the design of the course and the input itself. So it's not just about you feeling good about it. I have to push, and that's uncomfortable. But ultimately the outcome needs to be relevant for your context of work. Okay, so having said all of this, this video is about the Enlightenment and Land-Based Cosmovisions, which is Unit 3, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about lessons learned and outputs and stories, basically, from a project that I have with Cash that is funded by SSHRC on Aboriginal education. So this is the last input. That's the last big thing that you're going to hear from me. You must be tired by now. So I hope you enjoy it, and we'll see each other again on the 4th of April. So this project with Cash that is funded by SSHRC had two objectives. The first objective was to look at enhancement agreements, Aboriginal enhancement agreements, and to see how Aboriginal perspectives were being translated in these agreements. And the second objective of this project was to talk to Aboriginal elders who were practicing land-centered pedagogies in order to ask them about the aims of education, what they thought the aims of the education were, to collect some stories, and then to try to articulate a land-based framework or pedagogy that could be intelligible at the interface between land-centered and Enlightenment cosmovisions. So what we were trying to do was to counter grafting, basically, by trying to create an in-between story that could explain a little bit better what it would mean to learn from the land, or to have the land as first teacher, as Cash mentions in his text. So the first thing that is important to acknowledge in this project is that we had an expanded definition of colonialism, and we looked at it in terms of 4 different aspects. Number 1 was that colonialism was a denial of relationships. This is the existential aspect of it, and this is from the text of Dwayne Donald that you have read for this unit. The second aspect of colonialism that we included was that colonialism traps the imagination into wanting fixed boxes for things. So it wants to put the world in a box. And it offers us a single story of progress, development, and human evolution. Remember the yellow corn cob, right? So this is the box that the world is put in. And it has this obsession with singularities. It has to be a single story. So that's the cognitive and epistemic dimension of colonialism, a monoculture of the mind, or the other metaphor we've used in the course is the metaphor of the abyss. Then number 3, there's the next dimension of colonialism is that it creates a greed that is both economic and political, and the architecture of this greed is made out of boxes, right? So we're trapped in a greed full of boxes, and it's very difficult to think outside of these boxes, because these boxes are not only there to constrain us, but they also enable us, and that's the tricky thing of colonialism. I have a friend who said that the reason why colonialism is so difficult to address is because it is delicious. This is an Indigenous friend saying that why would people give up something that gives them pleasure, that gives them power, that gives them comfort? And he's not just talking about the settlers, that colonialism also offers some things to Indigenous people that promise these things, right? And the 4th dimension of colonialism we had in this project was that colonialism operates through a politics of entitlements that promise securities that depend on structures of violence. So the idea here is that when we want access into the structures of colonialism, we are buying into a system that requires violence for its maintenance, for its continuation. And then that becomes a cyclical process, because of course you don't want to be out of it and be suffering as a victim of this violence. But then when you ask for access into it, you're buying into a system that requires violence towards others for it to be sustained. I think in one of the papers, Cash mentions, for example, the situation in Guatemala, where Canadian mining is really wrecking the lives of Indigenous people in another country, at the same time that here in Canada, they are offering scholarships to Aboriginal students and of course paying their taxes here, and these taxes help pay our welfare system. So how do we relate to a system that depends on the dispossession and destitution of people in Guatemala for the well-being and the welfare of even indigenous people here? That's the paradox that the fourth dimension tries to address. So 2 points there that are also important to notice is that colonialism is rationalized as normal, just, and benevolent. It is clever, flexible, and adaptive. It's insidious, it's endemic, it's seductive, and it's enjoyable when people are benefiting from it. And therefore, resistance to colonialism that is intelligible to colonialism is already embedded within it. So it's like you can't talk against it, but very little is going to change. If it is intelligible to it, it's going to co-opt it or appropriate it. That's very disheartening. I know, I feel the same. But if we don't look the beast in the eye, we're not going to be able to go beyond what we believe is possible in terms of dealing with it, right? So the other point here is that changing our convictions does not change colonialism. So if we declare ourselves to be decolonized, that doesn't mean much. We may feel better about it, but actually we're still part of the same structure. So it's pretty challenging to be thinking about it with all its paradoxes and complexities, but our invitation is for us to be able to do that, to be thinking about, okay, so if this is not working, then what? What do we do? And that's one of the things we're going to explore in this video. So I told you about the first objective of this project, which was to look at Aboriginal enhancement agreements. And we looked very closely at the concept of inclusion. We've had this conversation before in class, but I just thought it would be good to recap here. So we created a framework looking at representation, recognition, and redistribution. And we looked at the Aboriginal frameworks, the enhancement agreement frameworks, to see where they would fit in this. So when we look at representation, we put here, based on the work of Sarah Ahmed, that it is about the body count, right? So business as usual. So we give you a space, we tick the box, and then we continue to do as we did before. So here we have the problem of tokenization. You're here so that business can go on as usual. We have the problem of display, the idea of you should be able to be part of our photograph to show that our brand is very inclusive. And there is the issue of debt. So the idea that you have your place, so you should be grateful to be at the table, to be invited to the table. So that's the first level. The second level is recognition, where there is an acknowledgement of harm, of inequality, for example, or inequity. And so you're given a place and the harm is acknowledged, but then people want redemption out of this act. So this creates a burden because then Aboriginal people are brought in to meet the needs of non-Aboriginal people, and there's the expectation of absolution. So you acknowledge me as a good ally by recentering my needs. So there's the whole politics of allyship happening here, where there is always a trade, right? I will do this for you as long as you do this for me. And then the last one is redistribution, which is about redistributing either power in decision-making or in resources. And the idea is forgive, forget, and move on to a place of my choosing, not your choosing, right? So the compromise here is that we already know where forward is. We will give you the resources to align with our agenda. And here it can represent a trap, because if you then talk about the terms of the conversation or the terms of the trade, you become the problem, right? So how come you don't want what we are offering you? And then there's also a betrayal and a cost that is paid by those who participate in this, because if the investments do not align, then there is a conflict of interest. So for example, an Aboriginal person representing a community that wants a different forward may find herself or himself in a very difficult position, having to compromise. The other thing that we found was that a lot of the times the compromise is metaphysical, right? So we want Aboriginal people who are very happy and excited about social mobility and about just joining mainstream society. So it becomes kind of a sugar-coated assimilation, as Glenn Coulthard puts it. And what we see with this enfranchisement is that questions of spirituality generally become secondary. And we see now a lot of again, conflicts of interest between those who want to associate indigeneity with spirituality and relationality, this ecological metaphysics, and others saying, no, we have moved on and we are already modern, and others saying we are neither one nor the other, we're something else. So it becomes very complicated at this point. And I think it's a good conversation, and it raises awareness about the limitations of inclusion and the limitations of what is possible in what I call a politics of entitlement. But we will go back to that later on. So I just wanted to recap this part about inclusion with you before we move on. So in terms of different cosmovisions, now because of how indigeneity is contested, it's very difficult now for me at this point in my work to talk about indigenous epistemologies as relational, because they are not all relational, or they are not all relational in the same way. But I can recognize that most of the literature still makes that association, although, as I said before, it's being contested. So I use Enlightenment versus relational epistemologies to talk about different assumptions in terms of metaphysics, what creates reality. Metaphysics is about what creates reality, ontology is about what the perception of reality is, and then epistemology is about how this reality can be known. Now, in terms of an Enlightenment cosmovision or metaphysics, it is based on a hierarchy of relations. It is human-centered, it's objective in terms of how it deals with reality, it offers universal descriptions, it desires and seeks certainty and control in these descriptions or through these descriptions. It is obsessed with stability and fixity, and it is based on an idea of separation between humans and the land, and humans and other humans, because there is a hierarchy of merit or of who counts as more human or more civilized. So there's a separation between civilized and barbarian, and there's right now a separation between first, second, and third worlds. We don't hear about the second anymore, but this separation used to be about capitalist and non-aligned nations, and now it's become something else. But anyway, there is a separation there. In terms of relational cosmovisions, they tend to be horizontal. So it's land-centered. It's based on our relationship with the land, both as a material entity and as a spiritual entity, something that nourishes us in both senses. Reality was subjective. In the example I have, for example, in Brazil, we would have a river dividing, like with one community on one side, the other community on the other. One community thinks that or believes that they come from the fish of the river. The other community say they come from the trees. For their creation story says that. And they intermarry, they speak different languages, and they incorporate both stories, not into one story, but they have a relationship with story that knows that stories are not literal. So they would never go into to the other side of the river and kill people because they don't believe in their story. That is something that I would associate with a pre-Enlightenment European ontology, not just European actually, but that's a different story. They would never do that because their relationship to knowledge is that the stories we tell are the stories. Ultimate reality is beyond our understanding. Therefore, knowledge is always subjective. It can be collectively subjectively or individually subjective. And some cultures do have prefixes that indicate whether it's collective or individual subjective, but they are subjective. And the stories are always metaphorical. As I said before, we can't, the idea is that we can't really grasp the whole of reality. The idea is not to create a story to describe the whole world or to put the world in a box. It's to create metaphors that mobilize different realities and different ways to relate to the world. And instead of certainty and control, there is this relationship to indeterminacy, this idea of cyclical change, that things are going to change, that the only certainty is that there's going to be change, and we need to prepare for that, and that's fine. But we know a little bit about the cycles, so there is change, but there's also continuity in that change. So there's no change or stability, so there's change and there's stability in change. And in Brazil, we also have the idea of the anaconda, which is this huge snake. And what they say about it is that in order to anaconda to remain the same, it needs to shed its skin and grow new ones so that it has some continuity. Because if it just gets stuck within one skin, it can't grow, which is an interesting thing, I think, for us to think about in terms of different metaphors. So there is also in relational ontologies the understanding of entanglement. So instead of us being separate from the land and from each other, we are in each other. We are each other. So the responsibility that entails is very different from thinking that I am in separation from each other and in competition with others. So while one ontology, the Enlightenment ontology, sees people, let's say, as self-sufficient and in competition, and therefore some people then would be redundant or dispensable in the system, this other system sees everybody as insufficient and codependent, right? So everybody is indispensable because we are part of each other. We are in each other. Okay, so these are the basic differences, but of course, this is just a representation, just a framework for us to start talking about it. Things are much more complicated than that. Let's take just two of these aspects, the first two of each list, and see that in this next slide, we can have at least 4 other configurations just out of 2 of the things in the list. For example, we have human-centered versus land-centered and hierarchical versus horizontal, but we could have hierarchical relationships together with human-centeredness, which is the Enlightenment ontology, which is A, but we could also have human-centered relationships that are horizontal. That's B. So some people who would fall in this category would be like the self-defined in this category would be anarchists, for example. Human-centered or horizontal relationships. Then we have C, hierarchical relationships and land-centered. So still putting the land at the center, but establishing hierarchies of worth of people who are more important than others. Some indigenous communities were, I think, in that category, and we can see indigenous communities that promoted slavery, and there were indigenous communities that were part of the slave trade, would probably fit into C. And then there is D, which is about horizontal relations and land-centered. And this D is the one that we focused on in this project with Cash. We wanted to understand D better and not try to translate it into A, B, or C. We wanted to see if we could get closer to a deeper understanding and our articulation of D. And here you have this D as closer also to a politics of obligations, whereas A is promoting a politics of entitlements. And we talked about that in class as well. Okay, so what did we want to do? We wanted to create resources for teachers, and this was inspired by another project, which is one of your educational resources for this unit, which is called Through Other Eyes. Now, the Through Other Eyes project was funded by the British government in 2006, and it finished in 2008. So in this project, I went with a colleague from Brazil to 5 different communities where we identified partners and elders who had a double vision, who had gone through the Western system. Who first of all, he had their indigenous language as a first language. They had gone through the Western system and decided to go back to the community and had a very strong critique of the Western system. We wanted them to tell us what they thought of the Millennium Development Goals, so what they understood the goals to be about and what indigenous goals would look like if they were to replace those. So we asked them about notions of education, development, equality, and poverty, and we asked them to give us a different perspective, and we created these resources for teachers, which are still very popular until today. So you will find the resource with 4 different units that are used, for example, to train people in England to go abroad and work with indigenous communities and to break the arrogance of the yellow corn cob, to get people to realize there are different corn cobs. Not that we want to replace the yellow corn cob for a purple corn cob, for example. This would be silly because we're back to one single story. The idea is that every corn cob is just a corn cob. It's just a species of corn cob. And it's in that they have their own gifts and insufficiencies and limitations and potential to grow and evolve as a species too, right? So we're all walking this different and sometimes similar paths, and we have old knowledge systems have limitations. They're all partial, but they also have gifts to give, and approaching them differently is, I think, what we were trying to get at. So we offered critical examinations of interpretations of both Western and indigenous worldviews and tried to create a scenario where people would go beyond either the tokenization or the stereotyping or the romanticization or the essentialization, seeing these communities as complex, but also understanding the power relationships between non-indigenous and indigenous populations and taking that very seriously. So from that project, we started this project with Cash, and one of the things that we did, as I said in the beginning, was to sit with elders on ceremonial grounds and ask them about what a pedagogy of the land pedagogy would look like. What would it feel like? And we asked for stories. We didn't ask them to give us a lecture about that, but if they wanted to give us a lecture, we would be happy to hear as well. They didn't. Most of them told us stories or answered questions that we had. So the first story I would like to share with you is a story by John Cryer, who is a Cree elder who lives near Edmonton. And the story that he shared is the story of the 4 mountains. And in this story, the aim of education, and that's, I think, the most beautiful part of it, when we asked him what's the aim of education, he said, the aim of education is to support people to become good elders for all relations, right? So not to be to become good income generators or to have a good job, but to become good elders for all relations. So the story of the 4 mountains is that, so you have to imagine the 4 mountains, and there's a picture there to help you to do that. 3 mountains in front, 1 mountain behind. First mountain is the mountain of the baby. So that's the mountain you have to go up and down when you are a baby, and you need somebody to hold your hand. So that's the first mountain that you have to go through, and it's the mountain where you learn about self-insufficiency, and you start to build the strength in your legs so that you can walk on your own, but never alone. That's the difference there. So the second mountain is the mountain of the warrior, and I think this is the teenage mountain. And what he said was something like, this is the mountain where you get lost in the dark in a forest and you start shooting at the shadows of the trees. Don Quixote one. So in this mountain, the trees know who you are, but you're trying to figure it out, and you can't hear the trees because you're trying to figure it out on your own. That's why you're shooting the shadows of the tree. You're fighting yourself basically in this mountain and trying to figure out who you are. And the trees know, but they can't tell you directly. They're trying to tell you in another way. So that's a very difficult mountain. And one of the things that John said was that, unfortunately, we're losing a lot of people in this mountain. They are not being able to get down. Now, the third mountain is the hunter mountain. That's the mountain where you learn from the warrior mountain about what your skills are, what you're good at, and now you offer, in the hunter mountain, you offer your skills to the community and you feed your community. Then you are integrated into the community in a way that supports others, right? Supports all the others to be able to survive. So that's the hunter mountain. And then the last mountain, which is at the back, is the elder mountain. And what he said was that this mountain we climb, but only our spirits finish. So we have to shed our bodies in order to finish. And as we shed our bodies, we can look, once we shed matter, we can look back at the other mountains and see we were never alone. Our ancestors were with us throughout the journeys, helping and guiding and watching over us. So the other thing he said about this mountain is that this is the mountain also that touches the baby mountain, because the warriors have no patience and the hunters have no time. It is the elders who have the wisdom and the patience and the time to be able to be with the young ones, and they should be the ones holding their hands. They are also the ones who are waiting for you at the intersection in between the mountains. So when you're coming down each of the mountains, the elders are there to help you, guide you to the next mountain that you need to go to. So for me, this story has been very important because it does give us a new blueprint for imagining life, basically, in education, where the objective of education is to prepare people to go through the 3 mountains first and reach the elder mountain, where you look at the other mountains in a good way and be a good elder for all relations. So that's one of the stories that we share with the teachers. Another story we share with teachers, in this one came from a conversation with Keith Chief Moon and Karen Chief Moon on what they imagined the problems of education were. And they used the medicine wheel to talk about that, and we reproduced it here in terms of 4 dimensions of being: spiritual, cognitive, physical, and affective. And they identified problems in each of these areas that young people are facing today. So there's disappointment and there's a void in relation to the spiritual dimension. There's poor decisions and arrogance in relation to the cognitive dimension. There's a disconnect and self-exile in relation to the affective dimension. And there is low life force and addiction in relation to the physical dimension. So when we asked him about what would solve these problems, what education could do to solve these problems, we were also a little surprised with the answers, and that's why we share this. So in terms of cognitive dimension, what we were told is that we need better stories in order to have more balance and steadiness of mind. We needed more silence in the spiritual dimension in order to be able to listen and connect to ourselves first and reignite the sense of connection with everything else. In the physical realm, we needed resonance, we needed drumming, and we needed sweats in order to get back in pace with the rhythms of life and the earth and the cycles and the universe. And in the affective dimension, the emotional dimension, we needed presence. We needed to be in the moment, not in the past, not in the future, not somewhere else, but right here, right now, in the moment, witnessing and receiving and responding with wisdom to what's in front of us. So that's another story we share that we believe is extremely interesting. We also had lots of conversations about what entanglement meant, like this idea of being one with everything and being in each other or being each other. And this story didn't come from an elder, but it's kind of our own articulation of one story to explain what is meant by entanglement and what is meant by separability. And one of the things we learned is that we're not either separate or entangled. We're kind of both at the same time. So how do we think about that? And we try to put that in a framework of layers of reasoning. So in one layer, there's me. It's separate from each other in my own understanding of myself, which is fine. It's one layer. The second layer is that there's me and you, right? I am me in the community. It's still separate, but there is a relationship between me and you. So these are the 2 layers of separability that the Enlightenment understands very well. And most of our politics are based on these 2 layers of understanding. However, there are 2 other layers and more that we don't necessarily have the words to talk about. There is a layer not in our Enlightenment institutions. The 3rd layer is a layer where there is me in you. There's me in you in many different ways. There's me in you in the sense that if you think about the earth as a living entity or an ecosystem, we're cells of this bigger body. So we breathe, and our breath is if we think about air as a body too, right? This body of air enters my body and is necessary for me to survive. At the same time, water and food are also other bodies that enter my body. And this body then changes so that life can go on. So that's one layer that we are viscerally in flesh or in matter related to each other or in each other. There's also the layer of neither me nor you at another level, pre-matter, pre-life. We are one thing. It's the same thing that gives life to me, gives life to you, gives life to my dog Geisha, who's just complaining at the door on the floor that she's not being given attention to. So at least these other 2 layers of me and you are us all, but neither me nor you being the center, are lacking in our education system, and we need to develop ways to engage people in that. And one way of doing that is through spiritual practice, especially indigenous spiritual practice, ceremony, but there are many other ways we can engage these 2 layers. It doesn't have to be through the same practices. However, these are layers that do not emphasize intellectualization. They emphasize sensorial perception. They emphasize the body. They emphasize the senses. They emphasize silence rather than dialogue and talk. and they emphasize obligations rather than entitlements. So although I say, okay, you can develop it in many different ways, it's not as easy because we are really, really addicted to thinking and relating through the first two layers, the me and you. But what's important, I think, in this conversation is that this is not about ditching one layer and having another one. It is about an alignment of the four layers. But before this alignment can take place, we need to give more attention to and develop the third and the fourth layers so that they can be stronger and have more of an influence in this alignment. Another picture that can show this that we came to draw in order to help us understand things is this picture where we have this flow of different things that represent us, and then we have our self-image that is so much smaller than what we really are. So part of what we heard in the stories is that what modernity and the Enlightenment have done to us is that they have made us believe we are less than what we actually are. We are much bigger than this. And the idea is that it's not that we're much better than this, it's that we're both better and worse than this. So we are the whole spectrum of humanity within each one of us. We have all these different, because if we are in each other, we are each other. And we are as weak as the weakest link and as strong as the strongest. So how do we find a way to think and relate and sense this visceral connection again, so that we can learn from both the shadow and the light and walk with this multiplicity inside of us. So these ideas have really influenced the way I started thinking about pedagogy in education. And you saw some of it in the course, in the design of the course, about acknowledging our complexities and acknowledging the differences within us, because if we don't acknowledge that, we project it outside and it becomes an aggressive projection, and that doesn't take us to different places. It will take us back to the same circular space of justification of violence and colonialism. So if we want to decolonize, we have to tap our capacity to see ourselves as more than what we have become, and to see the potentiality that exists in there for either terrible things and or wonderful things together, and then make wise decisions accordingly, with compassion, with humility, and with generosity, if we want to break the cycles. So in order to wrap up, I have here just a summary of what we have been saying about enlightenment and relational cosmovisions, in what I have found in another project in relation to policies. So I was looking at policies of global citizenship education. That's part of my work, the other side of my work. And I looked at UNESCO policies, Canadian policies, and the words that were used to that what was being prescribed for education in terms of meeting global challenges. So in terms of enlightenment ontologies, we talked about empowerment, leadership, consensus, progress, national identity, dialogue, innovation, affluence, and competition. And then I tried to think about what I was learning in this other project and then what I had learned in projects before that in relation to relational cosmovisions and how they would be different from that language that I saw in the documents. And what here's a summary of what I found out. So for example, instead of empowerment, we would be talking about disarmament. Instead of leadership, decentering. Instead of consensus, consent. Instead of progress, remembering. And remembering in two senses, both in terms of memory, as we have seen in the texts, and also in remembering and in putting members of a body that has been dismembered together, back together again. So instead of national identity, we would talk about planetarity. So instead of belonging to just one nation, we belong to the planet. Instead of dialogue and talking, presencing, and presencing requires shutting up and being able to listen to your and just not to be intellectualizing all the time, to be able to just be. Instead of innovation, wisdom. Instead of affluence, giveaway. And instead of competition, complementarity. So again, this is a framework for understanding the differences, but it's more complicated than that, because we don't want either or. We want both and more, and we want both of them applied appropriately and respectfully in each context. So we want to have both. When people ask me, so you're working with all these indigenous education systems, and you have put your kids through indigenous education systems, and I have, in the different places that I have lived. My kids have learned indigenous languages and gone to indigenous schools. And they say, so you don't want your kids to have access to the Enlightenment cosmovision? And I said, of course not. Of course, I want my kids to have access to the Enlightenment cosmovision. But do I want my kids to have access only to the Enlightenment cosmovision? Absolutely not. I want my kids to have a breadth of experiences in depth in these experiences and possibilities, so that they can be prepared to address the challenges they will face in the future that are going to be specific of their time and something that I cannot even imagine. But if they have more cosmovisions, more knowledges to draw from, but also a better understanding of the limitations and the recurrent mistakes of these knowledges, they will only be able to make, my hope is that they will only be able to make different mistakes in the future, not the same ones. So that's my answer in terms of the education that I want for my kids. I hope that it has given you some thoughts about the education of the people that you have in front of you in your context of work. So yeah, I think that's what I had to share for today. If you can include that, your reflections on the video in your reflection journals, that would be great. I look forward to hearing from that. And if you believe that there is any way we can, if this specific frameworks appeal to you and you want us to see if there is any possibility for a partnership or a collaboration, we're also open to discussing that. So I hope you have a great week and that you enjoy Cash's session, and we will talk again on the 4th of March. Thank you. Bye-bye.